two stories on why I think language is really important. I'm going to tell you about Darren and Andrew, one about social development, one about emotional development. When I worked in a nursery, we did gender stuff, and we had this puzzle of a big butch guy with a big mustache doing the washing up with two little children at his knees, because it was supposed to teach children that boys can do the washing up too. And Darren sat down and looked at the puzzle and laughed hysterically. And I said, "What's so funny, Darren?" And he said, "That lady has a mustache." So the point about language is that it gives you an insight into what children are thinking. And the other one I really liked also from that time was my colleague Vivian. Her little boy was the first grandchild in the family, and when he was 3, the second grandchild was born, her sister's son. And when he saw his grandmother pick up the new baby, he said, "Put that baby down, I'm your special boy." And what was wonderful about that is that he didn't pinch the baby. That, he was able to say how he felt. And because he was able to say how he felt, it meant the adults around him could deal with how he felt. And that ability to communicate, we do think of it as a cognitive skill. And of course it's a cognitive skill, but it's the key to so much interaction and so much problem solving that I think it's extraordinarily important. And that's why I pushed it very hard on the Lottery's A Better Start program. Right, our next speaker is the brilliant Vivette Glover, who's been working on infant mental health. I can't say how long, but I know as long as I've been interested in it, Vivette has been the absolute expert in it, and she's going to talk to us about infant mental health. So thank you, Vivette. Yeah.
Right, my talk's going to be a bit different from the others because I'm not going to be talking about an intervention or RCTs, but I'm going to be talking about an area where I think we need much more in the way of intervention. So if one thinks about the early environment and its impact on child development, the most important aspect of the early environment is the mother, and a very important aspect of how she interacts with her child is affected by her mental health, both in pregnancy and postnatally. So anxiety and depression are still the Cinderella of the NHS, and are still rather the Cinderella, I think, of research in this area. This is information from Lord Layard, who did the Happiness Hour, but he concluded the single biggest cause of misery in our community is mental illness. 40% of all disability is due to mental illness, and it's very widespread. As anxiety and depression affect about 9% of the population at one time, anxiety about 4.5%. Depression alone is rarer, but it can be very serious too. And I don't know if you know this, but women have as many symptoms of depression and anxiety during pregnancy and postnatally. One hears so much about postnatal depression and almost nothing about antenatal. And how many of you is that familiar to? Just still quite a minority. And the press, I don't know how we need to get it out there, but everyone's heard of postnatal depression. Antenatal depression and anxiety are just as common. 10 to 25% of the population have major or minor depression during this perinatal, that means pregnancy in the first year period. And pregnancy can also be a time of increased domestic abuse and relationship strain. This just shows some of our work, but it just shows, that's the Edinburgh Postnatal Depression Scale that could be used in pregnancy, that's the cut-off that's used. But you can see some women are depressed all the way through pregnancy. This is 18 weeks antenatal, 32 weeks and 8 weeks postnatal. Women go in and out of depression, and only 3.5% are depressed postnatally without having been depressed antenatally. So antenatal depression and postnatal depression, antenatal depression, antenatal anxiety are really the major, and there are several others, but are a major risk factor for postnatal depression, but also matter in themselves. Because the mother's emotional state in pregnancy and postnatally can have a long-lasting effect on her child. We all know that how we turn out depends on an interaction of our genes and our environment. What we now realize is that the environment starts in utero. The brain is forming in utero and is actually very susceptible to outside influences. And the influence affects the younger child and persists to the older child at least. So this is the concept of fetal programming, that the environment in the womb during different sensitive periods for specific outcomes, depending on what bits of the brain are developing when, can alter the development of the fetus with a permanent effect on the child. Permanent if there isn't an intervention. So prenatal stress has now been, this is a fairly recent area of research about the last 15 years. It's been known in animals for about 50 years, but in humans this research has been going on for about 15 years around the world. And different forms of prenatal stress have been shown to be associated with increased levels in the child of anxiety and depression, emotional problems, behavioural problems, ADHD and conduct disorder, impaired cognitive development, especially language, sleep problems in infants, neonatal behaviour, more difficult infant temperament. A couple of recent studies showing that increased victimisation in childhood and more likely to be bullied, perhaps because we don't know why, but perhaps because of some of these other features. And the evidence about increased risk of schizophrenia and autism is a bit mixed. 2 studies have shown yes, 1 no for each. It's also associated with physical altered development, somewhat reduced birth weight and gestational age. Those effects aren't as marked as the ones I showed you before, but they're well reproduced. Mixed-handedness, the child's more likely to be mixed-handed, which doesn't matter in itself, but it's known that that develops in the womb, and mixed-handedness is associated with increased risk of a whole lot of neurodevelopmental problems like dyslexia, dyspraxia, autism, and so on. Altered fingerprint pattern, decreased telomere length. Telomeres are the bits at the end of your DNA, and decreased telomere length is serious because the shorter the telomere length, the less likely people will live. That's a recent study, and it needs confirming 2 studies, but it suggests that all the other things prenatal stress associated with might also be associated with living less long. Increased risk of asthma and altered immune function. So it's clear from this there are a large range of different things that prenatal stress is associated with. Stress in this whole field is a term that we don't like but we can't get rid of. It's a sort of umbrella term that encompasses anxiety and depression, and those are what have been studied most. But it's not limited to anxiety and depression. Some studies have looked at maternal daily hassles, some at pregnancy-specific anxiety. Some women get very anxious about the actual outcome of their pregnancy. This affects these outcomes. Partner or family discord, that's quite well established. The partner has a role, we're hearing about relationships, the partner has a role while his partner is pregnant. The father can be supportive and ameliorate problems, or be unsupportive. In one study I did at Queen Charlotte's, it's very middle class clientele, about 10% of the women said their partner was emotionally cruel to them. It really startled me. And if they did, we followed the children up later, that was associated with decreased cognitive ability in the child and increased anxiety in the child, allowing for all sorts of covariates. So the father's important too. The distress caused by the 6-day war in Israel. This is one not very good study, but it just makes one alert that if one thinks what's going on around the world in places like Syria now and so on, it's not just affecting people now, it's likely to be affecting their children. And then there's quite a few studies of the outcome for the child if the mother while pregnant experiences a natural disaster like a freezing ice storm, a hurricane in Louisiana, or the studies of following up children whose mothers were pregnant in Manhattan during 9/11. So it's not just anxiety and depression, it's this umbrella term stress. If the mother is stressed in various ways, anxiety and depression are the most assessed, this can affect the development of her child. And it's important to know it's not just extreme or toxic stress. Some people like to talk about toxic stress, but it's in this area it's really not. It's not just toxic stress, there's a gradation across the range, and it's not just diagnosed mental illness. Post-lapse in pregnancy, postnatal depression, also associated with a similar range of problems in the child, increased emotional problems, increased behavioural problems, including conduct disorder, increased cognitive problems. Though one recent study showed no increase in cognitive problems when antenatal maternal mood was allowed for. A lot of the studies on the effects of postnatal depression haven't actually allowed for antenatal depression, but some have. I mean, I think that, and I'll just show you some of our data, I think that both are important. Postnatal depression is operating in quite different ways from antenatal, which is biological, but depressed mothers, it's well established, fail to interact well with their infants. You may have seen some of the videos of mother-infant interaction that normally there's a lovely dialogue establishes, the mother smiles, the baby smiles, the mother puts out her tongue, the baby puts out her tongue, they wave at each other and so on. They establish a lovely interaction. And depressed mothers often can't do this. They're just blank, or they're over-intrusive. They sort of poke, but they don't react in this lovely interaction with their babies. And that, there's a lot of evidence, can have long-lasting effects on the development of the child. So I'll just show you briefly some of our results which illustrate how one researches some of this. We've used ALSPAC, the community study, Avon longitudinal study of parents and children, also known as children of the 90s, large prospective birth cohort, which is what's so good about this was it started in pregnancy. Been a lot of birth cohorts, but till ALSPAC they haven't started in pregnancy. They had ratings of maternal anxiety and depression at 18 and 32 weeks. We started off looking at anxiety, but all these results are very similar with depression. And for child behaviour, we have maternal report on the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire, the SDQ, which was mentioned this morning, when we use 3 dimensions for ADHD, anxiety, depression, and conduct disorder. And what's good about ALSPAC is it has a lot of all the covariates one will be interested in, because in this area it's actually hard to prove what you're looking at. You can find an association very easily. To prove it's causal is much harder, because if the mother is anxious while she's pregnant, she's likely to be anxious or depressed postnatally. She's likely to be smoking, drinking, poorer background, less education, and so on. But ALSPAC and the paternal effects too. But ALSPAC has data on all these, so we're able to analyse the outcome for the child, allowing for all these things. And we find that maternal prenatal depression or anxiety, the mother is in the top 15%, that's how we analysed it. The child has significantly higher problems on the total SDQ, going to 13. And we're now actually starting to analyse at 18, and it looks the same. So these effects persist. And one can convert that to probable mental disorder. And at 13, if the mother was in the top 15% for anxiety or depression, the child has about a 12% risk of a probable mental disorder, and it's double the risk if the mother wasn't. So it's raised from about 6 to 12. So what's important about this is that it's a clinically significant difference, but most children aren't affected. There's nothing inevitable about this, and I'll come back to that. Other things are operating too. There's postnatal effects, and I think there's genetic vulnerability as well. If the child is genetically vulnerable to ADHD and her mother is anxious or depressed in pregnancy, the child is then quite likely to get ADHD. If they're not vulnerable to ADHD, they won't. If they're vulnerable to cognitive problems, which is a different set of genes, then they're likely to have cognitive problems later. And actually, I think this is really important when we think about interventions too, that not all children are likely to be affected in the same way. I mean, in the biological literature, this is getting stronger and stronger as a way of thinking of things. It's not that stress causes problems, and I doubt if one intervention is going to help everything. It's an interaction between what's happening in the environment and the nature of the child. And then we also looked at postnatal depression, anxiety, and what we found was that the magnitude, we separated out ones who are anxious, not anxious or depressed at all, prenatally or postnatally. They were both, it's much raised, it's doubled, and this is if postnatal but not prenatal, or prenatal but not postnatal. So they're both, the message from this is they're both equally important and they're additive. It's not one against the other, they're both acting together. So we're interested in the biological mechanisms that underlie how in pregnancy maternal stress anxiety may affect the neurodevelopment of the child, and we've done quite a bit of research on this, which I can't go into, but we're finding that the function of the placenta alters. We don't know what it is, it must be some trigger from another, which allows more cortisol to pass through the placenta to the child. And we've also shown that if they're exposed to more cortisol and nutrient, that affects neurodevelopment. So we're just beginning to understand the biological underpinnings of this, and there's quite a lot of work again in animals going to this more. And this is a small study, but again, looking at the outcome of this is with colleagues in the Institute of Psychiatry. They chose to look at this track first by MRI, just shown to be altered in conduct disorder. It links the sort of emotional part of the brain with the frontal cortex, which is involved in cognition and planning. And the more stress the mother felt in pregnancy, the greater the alteration in this structure. And nothing in a control track they look at. So this is early days. We're just starting on this. There's a group in California doing similar work. But we are starting to find what changes there might be in the brain associated with prenatal stress. Why are the children affected in different ways? I mean, I think this is going to be a much bigger subject, and I think it's also relevant for interventions. But using this aspect cohort, we've found two variants we've looked at, both of which are important in the synapse, the links between neurons. And one of them, if you have different forms of this gene, of this one it's significantly increased at small risk of ADHD, conduct disorder, and cognitive problems. And this one associated with increased but small risk of emotional problems. It's now found that with schizophrenia, there are 120 different vulnerability genes. So this is going to be a complex subject. We're scratching the surface of it. But obviously, one's genetic vulnerabilities affect how one responds to one's environment. And we're also finding epigenetic changes in babies when they're born. That's changes on top of the DNA which affect how much a particular gene is expressed. And we're finding there's changes in the cord blood of the receptor for cortisol. So there's a question about whether people raise the question, especially with the prenatal effects, whether the associations are causal. There's no doubt about the associations. It's harder to prove they're causal, but I think the evidence is now getting very strong. Animal studies have certainly shown it, studies that allow for confounders, starting to understand underlying mechanisms, and changes are observed at birth. So this has big implications for society, because perinatal mental illness, apart from all these things being distressing in themselves and mattering in themselves, conduct disorder, ADHD, and low cognitive development are strong risk factors for later criminal behaviour. And I know this is what particularly interests politicians. And Tony Blair brought in the Family Nurse Partnership to Britain, Unborn Babies Targeted in Crackdown on Criminality was the Guardian headline when it started. Because David Olds in America, with this intervention, showed that less than half the rate of criminal convictions and breaches of probation. The Family Nurse Partnership, or Nurse Family Partnership in America, doesn't particularly target mental illness. I've talked to David Olds about this, and he wasn't really thinking about this when he devised it, but he certainly sees the importance of it. And the nurses must give a lot of social support. So though it hasn't been measured and that aspect hasn't really been drawn on, I'm sure they are helping with the mother's mental well-being as well. But this is important. In a more recent study, after it was brought in here, the benefits for crime violence were mainly for girls. Again, 2 isn't too late. Things go on afterwards, both better or ill. Now, again, I asked David Olds about this, and he said boys may need a top-up intervention in adolescence. They're mainly being brought up by single mothers. And that curve, that economic curve, which will be marvellous, I don't think it's going to just completely eliminate the need for later intervention. I think we do need to start at the beginning, but I mean, it's not all over by 2 or 3, and I think probably we will need interventions later and in adolescence. But the bit that I'm particularly concerned about talking about is the perinatal mental health care, and it's dreadful at the moment. This is based on analysis, based on data from England, America, and Australia. Out of 100 cases of perinatal depression, 40 are clinically recognised, 24 receive any treatment, and only 10% receive adequate treatment. And this is true in England today. I mean, there's more awareness of all this, but it's not happening on the ground. This is from a PhD I examined last year. One of the subjects was quoted as saying, emphasis of maternity services was 98% medical, physical thing, and 2% emotional. And said, they're more interested in you medically. Have you got any lumps and bumps and pain? They're not asking how you're feeling at the moment. Are you coping? So though the FNP is or the NFP is the only thing that starts in pregnancy and carries on as looked at long-term outcome. And that's the problem with what I have to say. There hasn't been an intervention that starts in pregnancy to help with maternal mental health and follow the outcome for the child. But I've heard of one that's going on in Australia, and I've heard about their pilot data, which looks extremely encouraging. But there isn't anything one can quote yet. But the role of professionals must be important. They'll be different from each mother. And I think the most important thing, they've got to detect and treat anxiety and depression in pregnancy. One thing I'd wish money to be spent on, it's more mental health midwives, not just one for one hospital. There's one at Queen Charlotte's where I work. That's one for 5,000 births. We think 10 to 15% of women need help. They help with relationship problems, housing, and postnatally help to teach sensitive mothering with video feedback. The women can help themselves, be told how to help themselves with yoga, massage, music, mentalization. And we all have a role to support pregnant women more. Fathers, employers, grandparents, it's me, friends. And the public health implications of this are really huge, because more than 1 million children in the UK suffer from neurodevelopmental disorders. We've calculated the attributable load due to prenatal and postnatal anxiety and depression, depending how you measure it, it's 5 to 15%. But there's a potential to reduce, if we could treat and look after pregnant women with emotional problems, which is just good in itself for them, but there's a potential to reduce the number of affected children in the UK by maybe 100,000. And if you're interested in this, I have a website called Begin Before Birth. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Vivette. Just 2 quick comments. One of the big messages for me is that this is not deterministic. The majority are not affected. It's the issue about how to identify who is affected. And in answer to your question, being poor in itself is not the issue. It's unlikely that you will be in poor housing if you're not poor. It is, so the way these things interact is enormously important, but we know from EPI that you can get, very good home learning environments in poor families if there's family support, if there's friends, if there's relations. There are other things that matter, not just money, but money does matter.